Hello, friends. It's come to my attention that some of you weren't very happy about the battles we chose in our record-smashing video about the 5 most epic battles in Chinese history. Well, I am a man of the people, so I pried, scoured, and dredged the depths of history, legend, and YouTube comments to right my wrongs for the greater good. And therefore, I now present to you 5 more epic battles of Chinese history. Fights on. Yeah, I know. Sequels are usually disappointing, but I'll try to break that curse by starting off big, with not only the worst war crimes in ancient history, but also probably the first, the Battle of Changping. Changping is the place where it happened, made up of the Chinese character for long and calm. Kind of ironic, I know. And zhizhan means battle of, where zhi indicates a possessive characteristic and zhan means battle. So literally, it's kind of like Changping's battle. Chinese grammar kind of flips things around sometimes. Just so you know, because you'll be hearing me say this a lot in this series. The year was all the way back in 262 BC, during China's Warring States period, when 7 states fought over the ruins of the Zhou Dynasty. The top dog was the state of Qin, and they had a bad habit of beating the living daylights out of everyone, because unfortunately, their top brass were some cold-blooded dudes that basically made the ancient version of 1984. You send a kid to army, you get paid. You snitch on a bro, you get paid. You don't snitch on a bro, you die. What a nice place. At this point, they had just beat down most of the small state of Han, but there was this little isolated spot called Shandong that they just couldn't take. The commander of Shandong knew he couldn't hold out forever, and he definitely didn't want to hand over his strategic region to the Qin. So, what did he do? Well, you know what they say. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. You see, Shandong was sandwiched between the overwhelmingly powerful Qin and the second most powerful state, the Zhao. And so, he called up the Zhao guys. Hey, nah, we ain't the best buds, but the Han just got beat and I'm kind of stuck here. I'm sure you don't want the Qin punching through me and getting a straight shot at you, so just come on over and take over my place before they come in and steamroll all of us. The king of Zhao was like, I gotcha, and sent his senior commander, Lian Po, to them. And he set up 3 defensive lines to hold off the Qin. However, before long, the Qin made their move and the first line fell hard and fast. Seeing their strength, Lian Po decided the best solution was to put all his efforts in reinforcing the second defensive line on the eastern edge of a major river and try to outlast the Qin forces. This turned out to be incredibly effective, and he was able to securely hold the line. But 2 years later, they were still stuck there. The Qin had the sheer numbers to keep the offensive going, and the cost of war started to take its toll on the Zhao economy. To make things worse, Qin spies also spread fake news that the whole stalemate was just because Lian Po was a senile old wuss that was too afraid to fight. Unfortunately, the Zhao king was known for rash decisions and believed the rumor. He recalled the old general and sent this brash young kid called Zhao Kuo in his stead. Zhao Kuo was basically an armchair general with no actual experience and was super stuck up because he knew every tactical trick in the book. But that was only in the books. The Chinese have a saying, 纸上谈兵, which means talking troops on paper. And that's literally all he could do. It's said that even his own parents warned that their kid was not fit to actually lead troops. But they were totally ignored. Like Mike Tyson said, everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face. And Zhao Kuo had never been punched in the face. As you can probably guess, that punch was coming real quick. Zhao Kuo was sent to the front, and the first thing he did was abandon the second line and assault the Qin forces across the river, hoping the sudden offensive would break them apart. Bad move. You see, the Qin had eyes on everything. When they found out their fake news worked and the Zhao replaced their seasoned veteran with a young upstart, they called in their own version of Hannibal to absolutely demolish the Zhao, a brutal general by the name of Bai Qi. Now, why Hannibal? Well, he was about to use the same tactics that Hannibal would use at the Battle of Cannae 46 years later, on the other side of the world. Bai Qi had figured that Zhao Kuo would immediately charge across the river, so he reduced the number of Qin troops there to lure them in and told those troops to immediately retreat back to defensive positions. As Zhao Kuo chased them down, he neglected to keep his supply lines in check, and Bai Qi led the Qin forces to circle around the Zhao army from both the north and the south, completely surrounding them and cutting them off from all their supplies and any reinforcements. Zhao Kuo wasn't able to break the Qin defenses in front of him either, and was forced to retreat back towards the third defensive line at Changping Pass. The Zhao forces regrouped and dug into their positions, but they couldn't make a dent in the walls that were closing in. Back home, the Zhao state tried to call for help, but as we know, their king had a tendency to make stupid decisions, and that had lost them a lot of goodwill already. When the other states got the message, they basically just told the Zhao to get wrecked. And that's exactly what happened. Bai Qi slowly tightened the noose and battered Zhao Kuo with constant attacks. Zhao Kuo and his army got so desperate, they started killing their horses for food, and eventually each other. They fought hard to try to escape, killing half of the Qin force, 250,000 troops in the process, but to no avail. 46 days after the siege began, Zhao Kuo made one more effort to break through and was killed in the process. The remaining soldiers surrendered immediately. Were it so easy? You see, Bai Qi was known for kicking butt and not taking names, which is to say, not only did he destroy their humanity, he didn't even bother keeping them around. He buried them alive instead, all 400,000 of them. For perspective, China's population at the time was about 40 million, which means Bai Qi terminated a whole 1% of the entire country in one fell swoop. And that's not even counting the soldiers that were already dead. After this crushing defeat, nobody stood a serious chance against the Qin anymore, and they would continue beating down everyone else to become the first unified dynasty. To try to make you feel better, 1,000 years later, one of the Tang Dynasty's emperors, completely unrelated to anyone from this era, had a memorial built for all of these poor souls. In the end, despite their ignoble deaths, they were not forgotten by history. Pretty rough, huh? Well, not only was the rise of the Qin dynasty brutal, its fall was brutal too. As Newton might have said, what goes up must come down, and the Qin dynasty would soon have to fall. And fall they did, at the similarly brutal Battle of Julu, Julu 之战. Fights on. The Qin dynasty officially began in 221 BC, but after the first Qin emperor died in 210 BC, the government quickly devolved into a weakened, nasty mess of conspiracy and infighting. The same states that the Qin had curb-stomped to unify the country a mere decade ago now took this chance to rise up and get their revenge. Before we get into the actual battle, we need to set the stage. It's 207 BC. Qin forces were going around crushing these rebellions and had just defeated an army of the state of Chu and took out their commander, Xiang. They then kept going and directly threatened the capital of the Zhao state, the same one from our last episode, and the Zhao called for help again. But unlike before, everyone was cool with them now, and so the king of the Chu state sent an army led by a smart strategist called Song Yi, with his second in command, Xiang Yu, the 25-year-old nephew of the Chu commander that the Qin just killed, Xiang. Song Yi set up camp near the Zhao capital and sat around for over a month making preparations. But Xiang Yu wanted to get going already, anxious for vengeance and valor. Song Yi, though, called him an idiot and told him to sit still and not do anything stupid or he'd be executed. Now, as you can imagine, telling a hot-headed young guy to chill out never ends well. The thing is, Xiang Yu wasn't just some nepo baby with more angst than sense. He was actually one heck of a fighter and a very capable commander. And well, as you can imagine, things soon escalated quickly. On the 46th day of the encampment, or, as Xiang Yu saw it, the 46th day of twiddling their thumbs and doing literally jack squat, Song Yi set up a big private banquet to send his son off on a diplomatic mission to another state. And not only did his troops not get to enjoy any of the fun or food, they were all stuck out in the rain while the big smart man was partying in comfort. And that's when Xiang Yu saw his chance. Using everyone's discontent to his advantage, he busted into Song Yi's tent the next morning and murdered him, announcing that the Chu king told him to take Song Yi out because he was in cahoots with that other state. Satisfied that Song Yi got what was coming to him and afraid that Xiang Yu would beat them all up, nobody made any objections. And when the Chu king heard about it, there was nothing he could do but make the young upstart the new commander. Now, the fight was really on. The Zhao defenses were stuck at a critical defensive point about 100 kilometers northwest of their capital, called Julu, literally giant deer. Yeah, I'm not quite sure where that came from. Anyway, they were being starved to death by the surrounding Qin army. Xiang Yu first sent a few expeditionary forces to back them up a little bit and get a feel for the situation. And after scoring a few small victories over the course of a few months, he decided it was time. Let's freaking go, you Qin scoundrels. Xiang Yu led around 50,000 troops across the Yellow River to Julu, telling his forces to pack light and carry only a few days' worth of food, destroy their pots and pans, and sink their boats. This became the idiom, 破釜沉舟. 破 means to break, 釜 means cauldron, 沉 means sink, and 舟 is a boat. So literally, breaking cauldrons, sinking ships. The term signified a point of no return, essentially the Chinese equivalent of crossing the Rubicon, because now that they had no food and no way to retreat, their only options were to either defeat the 200,000 strong Qin army and take their stuff, or get annihilated in the process. And it's not like there was much food left in Julu anyway. And so, Xiang Yu and his men fought like mad. Armies from other rebel states had arrived to help, but were all so spooked at the odds, they were all like, nah, I don't think there's any way we can win this, and just spectated from a distance, leading to another idiom, 坐壁上观. 坐 means to sit, 壁 is a wall, 上 means on top, and 观 is to spectate, literally sitting on the walls watching. But to everyone's surprise, his much smaller army of ragtag rebels killed over 100,000 Qin troops with nothing more than sheer tenacity, leading to yet another idiom. 以一当十. 以 is to use or with, 一 is one, 当 is as, and 十 is 10, as in using 1 for 10. Okay, maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, but it's a pretty solid KD ratio. The other rebel forces could only watch in awe and embarrassment, and all 80+ thousand of them submitted themselves to Xiang Yu's command after that. The Qin retreated and regrouped with another force of 200,000, about 100 miles away. Before they could decide what to do with themselves, Xiang Yu already swooped in and had them surrounded. Seeing the writing on the wall, they surrendered without a fight. But the problem was, he now had 200,000 extra enemy soldiers to feed, and there was no way of telling if they would cause trouble later down the line. As if his earlier power grab wasn't brutal enough, he took a page out of Baiqi's playbook and buried all 200,000 of them alive. Not nearly as bad as what happened last time at the Battle of Changping, but still, if it's any consolation, even though Xiang Yu would continue taking butt and kicking names with such expertise that he would gain enough power to get a shot at establishing his own dynasty, he would still be defeated at the Battle of Gaixia, as mentioned here in our original Epic Battles video, by a former Chu general called Liu Bang. Liu Bang would start the Han Dynasty in 202 BC, and his grandson would bring about the incredible upset at the Battle of Mobei, Mobei 之战. Ever since the Qin dynasty, China was always fighting off nomadic tribes out of northern Mongolia and the Gobi Desert called the Xiongnu, who had this annoying hobby of raiding the fertile lands of China. The Qin beat them back using brutal strength and sheer numbers, but the newly formed Han Dynasty that followed in 202 BC, led by the general Liu Bang, didn't have that kind of strength and manpower, and all he could do to keep them at bay was to basically pay them a protection fee. Nobody wants to pay a protection fee, and especially not for 70 years. Fast forward to 133 BC. Liu Bang's great-grandson, Emperor Wu, was now on the throne, and he was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to pay these northern nomads anymore. And he decided the empire was now strong enough to take them on, and began a massive military campaign to free the Han Empire from the humiliation of having to pay off these troublesome tribes. He was right. His campaign was immensely successful, and the Xiongnu were forced to retreat north of the Gobi Desert in hopes that Emperor Wu would chill out and not bother chasing them down anymore. But, as Sun Tzu says in The Art of War, a skillful fighter does not miss the moment for defeating the enemy. And Emperor Wu was not going to miss the chance to shut them up for good. In 119 BC, he decided to send his forces all the way up across modern-day Mongolia and the entirety of the Gobi Desert to whip them so badly that they would never ever dare to come back again. Which gives us the name of this battle, Mobei, which means north of the desert, or literally desert north. Emperor Wu split his army into two parts in a two-pronged attack up over the eastern and western sides of modern-day Mongolia. He handpicked an elite force to attack the eastern front because he got intel that the Xiongnu leader, which is called the Xiang Yu, was on that side. These super pro fighters spanked over 70,000 Xiongnu to death and pushed halfway into Siberia with relative ease, because the leader, the Xiang Yu, wasn't there, and those weren't the Xiongnu's best fighters. You see, the intel was actually a bluff, and the Xiang Yu and his main army were on the western front, directly where the normal, run-of-the-mill, not-so-elite Han guys were headed. This average, kinda mid-squad was made up of 20,000 men led by General Wei Qing. Born a lowly serf, but slowly worked his way up the ranks. He was a perfectly capable commander, but unfortunately, he was falling out of favor with the emperor and was therefore given the lesser route, as well as a bunch of annoying prima donna generals to deal with, one of which was an old veteran called Li Guang. Li Guang begged to lead the charge because he felt he was super close to a major promotion. But he had such a constant streak of bad luck that even the emperor was like, look, Wei Qing, whatever you do, don't let this guy lead. So, to shut him up and get him out of the way, Wei Qing sent Li Guang to take half the troops on a separate route to secretly flank the Xiongnu and launch a surprise attack from the other side. The old dude was pretty furious about that, but a direct order was a direct order, and he angrily stormed off into the desert. Wei Qing and his remaining force set off on a long, difficult march northward for 500 miles, only to run into the Xiang Yu waiting himself in ambush with his main force of 80,000 elite cavalry. Okay, so that escalated quickly. 10,000 Xiongnu horsemen immediately rushed them. Wei Qing had to think fast. He quickly ordered his armored chariots to run protective rings around his troops. That way, the infantry could be shielded from the Xiongnu's cavalry, while also shooting them down from within the mobile walls. He then assigned his own cavalry to back up these chariot circles and fight the Xiongnu off if they managed to break through. This was an incredibly effective defense, and they were able to fend off the Xiongnu until the whole thing became more or less of a stalemate. As night fell upon the battlefield, so did a sandstorm. Bad times were ahead for the Xiongnu. Without missing a beat, Wei Qing took advantage of the dust and the darkness to discreetly split his cavalry in two, sending each half to sneak around to hit the Xiongnu in a pincer movement from both sides. Suddenly, seeing the Han horsemen busting in on them from all directions in the swirling darkness completely shattered the Xiongnu lines. In the ensuing pandemonium, the Xiang Yu leader went missing in the desert somewhere, and 10,000 Xiongnu were overrun then and there. Remaining forces were chased 100 miles to a fort, which Wei Qing then besieged, captured, and destroyed, along with another 9,000 Xiongnu. With this complete and utter victory, Wei Qing proudly marched his troops back home. But you may be saying, wait, what about that guy Li Guang? Well, it was only then, on their way home, that Li Guang showed up again. Turns out this dude really did have some awful luck. His detachment had gotten lost in the desert and literally missed everything. Men and their habit of not asking for directions, right? Anyway, facing a court-martial for screwing up so badly, he went and took his own life in order to save himself the humiliation and preserve his honor. Wei Qing, on the other hand, basically got promoted to Secretary of Defense and was the top dog in imperial military affairs for the rest of his life. As for the Xiongnu, their military and command structure was shattered after this resounding defeat and were forced to retreat way up into the barren lands of northern Siberia, having lost almost 100,000 troops across the eastern and western fronts and a missing Xiang Yu that was thought to be dead, except it turned out that he was actually alive, and then there was a whole bunch of confusion about that. With all of these military, economic, and internal political problems, they would not pose a serious threat ever again. Well, not to China anyway, because their descendants became the Huns and ransacked Rome. But that's a story for another time. However, these wouldn't be the only dudes on horses to cause major problems for China. We're fast forwarding 1,000+ years to the Ming Dynasty, where in 1619 there was another battle involving horses and overwhelming odds. But this time, it was bringing horses to a gunfight. The Battle of Sarhū. Sarhū 之战. Fights on. For some background, at this point, the Ming Dynasty had been in power for 250 years and had control over a collective of nomadic peoples from northeastern China called the Jurchen, or in Chinese, Nuzhen. Yes, those characters are literally female truth, but that's just a transliteration of their native name. Anyway, at first, they were actually a bunch of separate tribes, but this guy called Nurhaci got in a fight with a rival tribe and took them over. And then he took some more tribes over, and more and more and more, until he had all of them under his control and decided he had enough of Ming Dynasty subjugation. He issued a statement called the 7 Grievances about all of the problems he had with the Ming Dynasty, and with his fellow tribesmen, declared war in 1618. Now, wait a minute, you might say. If you watched our video up there about China's craziest weapons, you might remember that the Ming had guns and bombs and rockets and all kinds of stuff. How would these nomadic Jurchen tribes be a threat to the Ming Dynasty? Put simply, the Ming got complacent. With all that tech, the dynasty had grown into a military superpower. But big tech can't help with big dumb. Their power also made them comfortable, smug, and prone to mismanagement. And Nurhaci used that weakness to strike a surprising victory immediately after his declaration of war. In response to that declaration of war, the Ming launched a massive assault on the Jurchen capital from all 4 directions in 1619, with over 100,000 troops against the Jurchen's 60,000. Those seem like good odds, right? Intelligent planning for sure, until the stupid hit. The Western Division, made up of 30,000 men, ran into heavy snow and arrived at a river on the western side of the capital later than planned. Annoyed, impatient, and apparently very drunk, their commanding officer, Du Song, took 10,000 men and decided to immediately cross the river and attack. And he didn't even bother wearing any armor while doing it. You see, because Nurhaci wasn't an idiot, he actually had a plan. The Jurchen had built a dam at the head of the river, and when Du Song was halfway across, they broke down the dam, sending a massive rush of water at Du Song and his 10,000 men, who then had to make a mad dash to cross to the other shore. His other 20,000 troops, which included all of his artillery, decided they weren't gonna risk crossing those rough waters to meet up with their commander. Not a good start. Du Song, now isolated, decided to set up 2 camps and take a breather with his troops. But before long, the Jurchen descended on and demolished both with ease. The Ming musketeers couldn't keep up with the Jurchen's speed, and the muzzle flash from each shot just gave away their position in the night. The first camp to fall was at Sarhū Pass, which became the name of this battle. The remaining Ming troops on the other side of the river regrouped with the northern division led by the general Ma Lin. Thankfully, Ma Lin was a lot smarter and a lot more careful, and hearing of Du Song's demise, decided to play it safe and set up 3 defensive camps to hold the Jurchen off. Except, Nurhaci had a plan for that too. He went straight for the primary camp, sending his infantry to distract one side while sending his cavalry to assault the other. They were so fast and so effective that the Ming gunners only had time to get off 1 shot before being punched through the Jurchen cavalry, and the main camp quickly fell apart. The other 2 didn't stand a chance either. Ming's Central Command ordered a full retreat after the catastrophic losses on those two fronts. But the Eastern Division, led by General Liu Ting, didn't get the memo. Instead, these 10,000 Chinese soldiers, followed by 20,000 Korean archers and musketeers, were making steady progress towards the Jurchen capital, right into a trap. See, Nurhaci planned for this too. He had his men on the Eastern Front fake a message for Liu Ting that Du Song, the guy who got defeated at the river out west, was getting close to the capital and he ought to speed up. Anxious for glory, Liu Ting fell for the fake news and pushed forward, right into a long and narrow valley. With impeccable timing, Nurhaci was already back from whooping the Ming's northern division and was refreshed and ready for phase 3, shooting fish in a barrel. His forces ambushed Liu Ting in the valley, and while the leading Chinese troops were able to fend off the first Jurchen assault, they were annihilated by the second. The Korean forces tried to fire back at the Jurchen ambushers, but strong winds blew their arrows askew and their musket smoke back into their faces, and they ultimately surrendered after a long fight. This left the Southern Division, led by General Li Rubai, which was slowly navigating mountain passes. Nurhaci knew they would take a while, so he went for the Eastern Division first. But did he also plan to make it back to destroy Li Rubai too? The world would never know, because Li Rubai did receive the orders to retreat, and for better or for worse, followed those orders. Why do I say that? Well, first of all, we'll never know if Nurhaci would have made it down south in time to defend against him. And second of all, even though Li Rubai got his troops home, he was immediately made a scapegoat and was accused of being in cahoots with the Jurchen. Otherwise, Nurhaci would have attacked him earlier. He decided to take his own life instead of facing a BS court-martial, which would probably get him killed anyway. The Ming ended up having lost 40,000 men versus the Jurchen's 2,000. And this started a gradual domino effect, which would lead to the dynasty's downfall at the hand of Jurchen forces, who would then become the Qing Dynasty. Turns out tech isn't always the answer. Until it is. For today's stunning and saddening finale, I present modern global politics and modern urban warfare. I present the actual first shots of World War II. I present Sarhū Huizhan, the Battle of Sarhū, better known to the Western world as the Battle of Shanghai. Yeah, that Shanghai. Fights on. Before we start, because this isn't some distant ancient battle, but a relatively recent event that remains a sensitive topic to many people, I want to note that this will be an abridged, hopefully objective account meant only to introduce this slice of history to those of us who aren't familiar with it. I will just provide a simple and straightforward retelling of what happened, so you can better seek out further documentaries and discussions if you so desire. Let's begin. Years before Europe became embroiled in World War II, East Asia was already in chaos. Imperial Japan had taken over northern China. The communists and the nationalists were busy fighting for power over the rest of China. But the strained relationship between China and Japan was a powder keg waiting to blow. And a series of unfortunate events would light the spark that would explode into an all-out war called the Second Sino-Japanese War, or for some, the true beginning of World War II. It was August 1937. Japan had had troops stationed around the bustling city of Shanghai for 5 years now with an eye on taking it over. And the wary Chinese kept their fingers on the metaphorical trigger. The US, The UK, France, and Italy brought both sides to the negotiation table to try to keep the situation civil and prevent further destruction and disturbances to foreign trade. But things were too far gone. The Japanese would not relent, and the Chinese would not give in. The foreign powers could do nothing but go home and hope that nobody shot first. But the troops from both sides had already congregated in and around the city, and they were all armed and angry. Nobody knows how and where exactly the fighting started, but when tensions are high, the smallest wrong move will snowball into disastrous consequences. First, small pockets of gunfire popped up around the city. That turned into some mortar fire from the Chinese. Then, a few artillery rounds from Japanese warships. But on the 14th, that escalated into Chinese bombing runs and ground assaults on Japanese forces. And China officially declared that they would defend themselves and resist Japanese occupation. And so, the Battle of Shanghai began. Some said it was as if the Battle of Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War, was taking place in New York City's densely packed 4-square-mile neighborhood of Harlem. How so? Well, between the two parties, there would be a total of 1 million soldiers fighting tooth and nail in the streets and skies of Shanghai. It would be the first and one of the biggest urban battles in all of history. The Chinese had a total of 700,000 troops, while the Japanese only had 300,000. However, Japan still expected the whole thing to be over quickly because they had 3 times the tanks, 3 times the aircraft, and 100+ ships. And not only did they have more equipment, everything they had was much more advanced. But were it so easy? You see, China had already been having quite an unfortunate time for the past few decades. Imperial China was overthrown in 1911, and the subsequent Republic of China, also known as the ROC or the Nationalists, was constantly dealing with all kinds of problems ranging from internal corruption and military uprisings from its own ranks, to external occupation by the Soviets and the Japanese, while simultaneously vying for power against the rising Chinese Communist Party. At this point, the ROC was led both politically and militarily by a guy called Jiang Jieshi, or more commonly known by the Cantonese romanization of his name, Chiang Kai-shek. And he knew that with Japan at his doorstep once more, China needed to get help. And so, he threw everything that he and the nationalists had at defending Shanghai, in the hopes that when the Western world saw that China's valiant defense amidst a city in flames that was once called the Paris of the East, they might just come to his aid, or at least tell Japan to back off. The Chinese, through sheer tenacity, ingenuity, and manpower, fought back against the very technologically superior Japan with literally everything they had. They used guerrilla warfare in the streets, took the rubble of bombed-out buildings to build defenses, ran suicide runs against bunkers, sent suicide bombers against tanks, and even repurposed guns from sunken ships to use as artillery on land. Literally every desperate measure. By the end of the month, fighting had expanded well beyond city limits along the rest of the coastline, from the streets to the skies, from the shores to the trenches. But as we are all well aware, over the course of history, technology has only gotten exponentially more destructive, and China's numerical advantage just couldn't keep up with Japanese firepower. But even in these dire straits, suffering innumerable losses, Chiang Kai-shek held on. What Japan thought would be a swift battle had now already lasted 3 months. It was now November 1937, and the Western powers were meeting in Belgium about the situation. They saw the chaos, they saw the desperation. Even if they couldn't stop the war, if he held on just a little longer, maybe they would at least send some help. But help never came. By November 26th, all surviving Chinese troops retreated from Shanghai, and 270,000 of China's best were dead. Japan, on the other hand, only lost about 20,000 men. All Chiang Kai-shek could do was to keep moving and keep resisting, despite continuous catastrophic losses, until 1945, when all Japanese military actions ended with the conclusion of World War II. And on that somber note, this concludes our second series of 5 epic battles of Chinese history. In retrospect, though, perhaps this isn't really 5 more epic battles, but 5 of the most incredible battles of Chinese history. From vast battlefields of millions of men to close quarters combat of 1 million men in cramped city streets, from horses and crossbows to machine guns and fighter planes, the ways of war are ever evolving. But, as Albert Einstein said, peace cannot be kept by force. It can only be achieved through understanding. Empathy is the only true answer to human conflict. And with that in mind, good night, good luck, and I hope we can all have more empathy for each other. Thanks for tuning into this series, and until next time, 再见! If you enjoy the deeper meaning behind Chinese culture, folklore, legends, and strange true stories, then come explore more with me on Jared Tells Tales, where mystery, meaning, and the otherworldly still live on. Click the link to watch your first tale.